huge thanks to all of you for packing this place. I really appreciate you all. That first tune was a tune by myself called Flight Time, kind of a play on Minnesota history and music, if you guys are familiar with the Flight Time band. And I originally wrote that tune for a group I play with called the Minneapolis String Project. And our initials are also MSP, so I was trying to tie in all the things. But it really feels like flying to play that tune to me, so give it that aesthetic as well. I was really fortunate to play with a bunch of these dudes in other groups, and I couldn't be more happy to play with my friends on the stage that I've been playing some of these tunes with for a long time now. So this tune is another tune of mine called Shred for the Common Man, and I've actually been playing it with a couple of different groups that you may have seen around town, L.A. Buckner and Big Homie. We just played at the Jazz Fest this past weekend, so I have a version of that tune that L.A. kind of remorphed. And then I originally wrote this one to play with New Sound Underground. Nelson was a part of that band, Ryan was, Austin was, and that was a really great training ground to play this kind of music. So this is Shred for the Common Man. It's kind of a hybridized version as it's kind of morphed over the years. Kai on the saxophone for this one. So we're gonna switch out here. Like I said, through teaching things like at McPhail, I was able to meet Lasse, and I was also very, very fortunate to work with this young gentleman. It's a pleasure for me to bring him to the stage. Kai, come on up here. Give it up for He's an awesome mandolin player, awesome band leader, really, really shining bright in the music community and specifically the jam band and the bluegrass community. And I had posted some stuff with me just messing around with mandolin because I wouldn't call myself a mandolin player. And I remember him responding and saying, "What is that? What are you working on?" And I was like, "I'm just doing some doodly stuff." But we were really connected on a lot of like progressive music that he was looking forward to playing and writing on mandolin. And when he passed, I felt compelled to turn those kind of doodlies into something more meaningful and just to remember the connection that I had with him, even though it was not super strong, just from knowing him on the scene and stuff. So this is a tune called Mando Max, dedicated to Max Graham. Another composer and band leader amongst us here, Nelson Devereaux. He's an amazing musician and artist. You guys should all check out him and his music. We got a show coming up next month at Ice House. This one is from your book series, right? Yeah, solo saxophone. Check that out if you're interested in some cool material to read. This one is called Hidden Bestial. This next tune is another tune by me called Copper Mug. I went through a phase of liking a lot of drinks, you know, like a Moscow Mule, you know, just keep the copper mugs in the freezer, you know. But this one was also a tune originally meant for New Sound Underground and kind of reimagined and taking back my tunes now that, you know, that band no longer really exists. Unfortunately. Yeah, but there is some New Sound merch here tonight. If anybody's looking for some very limited edition vinyl and CDs, come talk to me afterwards. Here we go. Our talented keys player Lasse Corson a few years ago before he hustled away to William Patterson in New Jersey, and he just graduated. And I think he's gonna go do the New York thing. But I met young Lasse. I was teaching at MacPhail Center for Music, and he was in one of the Dakota combos. And unfortunately, he was kind of on his way out, but I got enough time to meet him before he went away to college, and I really found out how amazing of a musician he is, and an amazing person, and also an amazing writer. And so as part of this show, I also wanted to feature some tunes by the band. So this is Lasse's tune. This next tune is a tune by me called Only. It's kind of a weird word. It's the town that I grew up in. And this year and this show is kind of important to me because it marks the halfway point that I've lived in Minnesota in my life. I spent 18 years in Maryland, and now it's been 18 years in Minnesota. So maybe I can start rooting for the Vikings or something. But anyway, this is a tune I wrote over 10 years ago now. And it's kind of like a homage to where I grew up.